China's political season gets underway. What can we expect in the wake of COVID-19? Hello, I'm Anand, and this is The Heat. China's top legislature and the country's top political advisory body begin their meetings this week, known as Two Sessions. The annual gathering of thousands of delegates and advisors is a major political and policy event in China. CGTN's Hui'Ao has more on what we can expect.
China's largest political event was delayed for 2 months due to the COVID-19 outbreak. Now, with the epidemic under control, China has set the new opening date for the Two Sessions, May 21st.
China is the first country to emerge with a rational plan for opening up. It has not defeated COVID-19, but it has contained it. At this point, they'll have a much clearer sense of what the rest of the year is going to bring.
However, the nation's economy was hit hard by the epidemic. The world's second largest economy saw an unprecedented decline in its first quarter GDP, shrinking 6.8%. As for 2020, the International Monetary Fund has forecasted a 1.2% growth for China's economy.
Despite the IMF's forecast being quite low, China's April data has shown a strong rebound in exports, and consumption picked up in March. Now all eyes will be on the growth target, which is normally set during the Two Sessions. It will be a key barometer to plan things for the rest of the year.
Beyond China, COVID-19 has wreaked havoc around the world. From supply chain disruptions to halted trade and investment, the pandemic has been a shock to both supply and demand. As the world will be watching the Two Sessions, China's economic recovery experience will be widely watched as well.
How to contain, this pandemic while at the same time not having a very significant impact on the economy. I think these lessons are all very important for the industrialized world to take a look at.
This year's Two Sessions comes at a very special time as the country has just been emerging from the deadly coronavirus epidemic. Now that China's largest political gathering will get underway on Thursday, it will show that the country is ready to move on. Hui'Ao, CGTN, Beijing.
We begin with Martin Jacques. He is a global affairs commentator, columnist and author. His book, When China Rules the World, is an international bestseller. We spoke earlier, and I began by asking him for his thoughts on China's Two Sessions.
Well, it's really become the sort of the place, the venue for the leading figures in the Communist Party and more widely to discuss and exchange views on the most important matters of the day. And over time, I think it's grown in importance as a sort of, a sort of plenary parliamentary event, if you like, in Western terms.
If we look at past Two Sessions meetings, it's been about policy, status updates, and setting goals. But now, of course, this meeting takes place in the wake of the pandemic. How will those priorities change?
Well, I'd be surprised if they didn't change a lot, because clearly the pandemic has had a huge effect on China, especially on the Chinese economy. But the ripples go much further than that. And I think that China has to review the situation and to some degree press the reset button.
All right, let's look at some of the economic goals. Beijing actually reported its first economic contraction since 1976 during the first quarter of this year. There was a drop of 6.8%. But now, given the uncertainties of the pandemic, there are analysts who are saying that we may not even hear of a GDP target for the rest of this year. What's your view on that?
Well, I think that might make sense because although the economy's been recovering strongly in April, or at least some of the figures have looked better than anyone was really expecting. I mean, this is a big economy now, and to get it firing on all cylinders again it's going to be complicated, and it won't be an easy matter. And of course, meanwhile, lurking in the around the edges of it all is what happens to COVID-19 and whether there. I mean, so far there's been quite small outbreaks in the northeast of China and so on, but obviously there'll be concern that it may reappear or recur in different cities, and because the Chinese have adopted, in my opinion, absolutely rightly, the policy of zero tolerance, then they'll go straight away, I think, for lockdowns, as they have recently. So I think that it may make sense, at least at this stage, not to strike a figure. But on the other hand, they may decide that they think they're in a position to do it.
Do you think the country will continue to move away from being a primarily manufacturing centre to more emphasis on service industries?
Yes, I do, because this process has been proceeding now for a few years, and it is to do with the maturing of the economy, the move away from being primarily a manufacturing economy, and that process, I think, will undoubtedly continue. And there is another factor to consider here as well, which is basically manufacturing industry has been very dependent on exports, which has been, I think, crucial to China's rise. Now, in the present global climate, there must be some doubt about how strongly export demand for Chinese exports, manufacturing exports, will develop post pandemic. I mean, China's come out of the pandemic at least 2 months before the European countries, and maybe 3 months before the United States. It's going to take quite a time for them to recover. I mean, the situation where I am now, which is in the UK, is that we're only just really starting the process of gradually coming out of the lockdown. So we've got no idea at the moment, beyond the point, what the economy here is going to be doing in 2 years' time. In 2 months' time, or something like that. So I think that that will be also a factor in the Chinese government's thinking. To what extent will the global markets recover? Which will recover? Which won't recover? And there's another factor here, of course, as well, and that's not just a straightforward economic one. It's a political one, which is the relations between the United States and China have deteriorated further, and the prospects don't look good, and therefore there may be attempts to weaken or cut some supply chains and so on, and that could affect Chinese exports.
And looking at domestic policy, Martin, let's look at the eradication of poverty. It's one of the major goals of the Chinese government. In the past 10 years, that figure has been brought down to 10%. Only 10% of people still living in poverty has gone down, rather, from 10% to just about 0.5% in the past 10 years. But now, given these difficult times brought on by the pandemic, do you think the goal of eradicating poverty completely by the end of this year can be met?
Well, it's a good question, and I don't easily know the answer. But I think the Chinese government will be very anxious still to meet the target if it thinks it's possible, because it's been a very central priority for the government now over a period, but especially, if you go back last year and the year before, the emphasis on the importance of eradicating poverty by this target, and I think they'll try and meet it. And it's a different kind of problem, I think, to the problem, for example, of unemployment, jobs, what's going to happen to real incomes and so on.
In your best-selling book, Martin, When China Rules the World, you argue that China will replace the United States at some stage in the future as the dominant power in the world. But now we have the pandemic. It's changed a lot in the world. Has your view on that changed?
No, it hasn't changed at all, really. I mean, of course, one has to take into account the events and the shifts. I think that COVID-19, I mean, one thing that I never anticipated at the time, because I wrote my book basically and finished it in 2008, published in 2009, China in 2010. At that stage, I didn't anticipate a president like Trump, and I didn't anticipate that there would be a big shift against multilateralism and a strong emphasis from a new American leadership on unilateralism. And although the American economy up to a point has performed not too badly in the recent past, I think that America's now, in many ways, it's more isolated. It's less, the attitude towards America under Trump globally has significantly deteriorated. So I think that has had the effect of hastening China's rise. And of course, the classic example of this is COVID-19. I mean, sure, let's not beat about the bush. China got off on the wrong foot when it tried to deal with COVID-19. But once China understood the situation, it moved with tremendous speed and huge effect. And China's performance is the best in the world on a per capita basis. On the other hand, the United States has performed abysmally.
Martin Jacques, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
There is more to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Gong is an economics professor at the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing. Sourabh Gupta joins us from Bethesda, Maryland. He's a senior Asia-Pacific policy specialist at the Institute for China-America Studies. And with us from our newsroom is my colleague, CGTN's Peng. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Peng, let me start with you. Give us a sense of why these two sessions meetings are so important, not just for China, but for the world. And what is the relevance of these meetings to the way China is run and to its future?
Well, actually, if you look at if you break down the two sessions, actually one key part of it is the National People's Congress. And by saying it Congress, it has the power to approve budget and most importantly to amend legislations. So the most important thing that we need to look at is where does the money go, right? Because definitely China was thinking about pumping a lot more money into healthcare system to make sure that there won't be another round of a virus outbreak like this one. But also China is also worrying about poverty alleviation, as well as making sure that people are still employed, right? So how are we gonna allocate the budget is one thing that we need to look at. And the other thing is how China will do things differently according to law, which is new legislations. For example, when the country is now slowly reopening, it has to make sure that it's being done safely and responsibly. Will there be new laws of, for example, asking all Chinese people to wear face masks on the street? That's something that we need to look at. So all these things are closely relevant to the health and wealth of not only Chinese people, but also people around the world, especially when we think about that the whole world is now still struggling against the coronavirus, while at the same time still struggling to reopen their economies.
Gong, this year's two sessions marks the end of the 13th five-year plan and the beginning of the new one. How do you think delegates will retool their policies, given that we now have to contend with the pandemic, with the coronavirus pandemic? And to what extent will this be a balancing act for the government? On the one hand, trying to get the economy reopened, on the other, making sure that there isn't another wave of infections?
Well, I think the fight against this vicious virus hasn't really completed yet. I think this issue is still being very much on the agenda among the lawmakers at this time. I think there's going to be a lot of reckoning, a lot of reevaluation about the initial days of this outbreak. Certainly, China could have and should have done better. So I think there's a lot of issues, a lot of questions and solutions, discussions about how to improve this country's overall governance system, especially in the public health arena. And this is going to be a very important agenda, I think. The second thing is, as your previous guest has alluded to, the discussions about the economic policies. I think fiscal policies is very important right now. It's the primary tool to stimulate the economy. And I think lastly, the foreign policy is also very important. There's going to be plenty of discussions about that. China is facing an unprecedented pressure from international community as this virus spreads around the world. Now we are seeing, this thing is getting to the southern hemisphere. You see these numbers from South American countries shooting up very rapidly, and also very worried about the situation in Africa. I don't think the numbers really reflect the real situation on the ground right now due to the wide availability of testing kits. So I think these issues are all very important. So I think in terms of your question about the thinking about the next 5-year plan, I think it's probably in the back burner right now. I think the primary issues are these pressing imperatives that we have to deal with right now.
Sourabh Gupta, of course, the coronavirus pandemic has cast a huge shadow over the entire globe. There will be a focus at these two sessions meetings, of course, on public health. There was something like 300 proposals put on the table, including some on improving communications between local government and central government in China. So what are the lessons, do you think, that have been learned from the pandemic?
First of all, I want to say that the wide consensus is that China's initial response was a poor one. Frankly, I think the received wisdom is wrong on that. China's initial response was not perfect, but it was very good. But nevertheless, speaking in that context, international health regulations do require that if you can give a notice within a 24-hour period, do so. It's important to have voices heard with regard, even at the local level. And I think the Chinese government has internalized this, and it's very helpful that it's moving out so quickly on broader epidemic prevention by passing legislation, but also specifically certain deficiencies in terms of reporting these sort of incidents, that reporting didn't have to wait from December 27th to December 30th, that it could be reported on December 28th itself. Now, that would not have made a material difference, let me emphasize that, but still, it is important that these little improvements are made so that even when we are faced with a 1-in-100-year pandemic, the response can be as best as possible. And China's response was pretty close to it, but not perfect.
Peng, of course, the economy, the coronavirus pandemic, and public health will be high on the agenda at two sessions. But what are some of the other issues that will be discussed at these meetings?
Well, of course, as you said, public health and also emergency response, as the last guest said, how can we streamline the emergency response in China is also another thing that we need to talk about during the two sessions, and also reopening the economy. These are topping the agenda, at least the media attention, that they are watching closely on what China will do in terms of how to approve budget and also pass legislations. But actually, if you look at it, actually the two sessions came, especially for the National People's Congress, all the lawmakers came from all walks of life there in China. They include Chinese President Xi Jinping, for example. He is one lawmaker and has just one vote. And there will also be other lawmakers, for example, a lawmaker who is actually working as a migrant worker in his ordinary times. So that's another lawmaker. He also has one vote and also the same amount of say in the two sessions. So because they come from all walks of life, people may raise all kinds of different proposals based on their own personal working experience. For example, a scientist may raise proposals on, for example, how to build better AI development environment in China, how to build 5G base towers in China in a more efficient way, while a farmer may raise more proposals on, for example, how to raise pigs more efficiently and more competitively in China so that they can compete better in the world. So there are all kinds of these discussions going on, and all these issues might be brought up during the two sessions.
John, Gong, I want to look at one of the economic challenges, and that is employment in China. Of course, the government is placing a strong emphasis on ensuring that there is, full employment, and also we'll look at people's livelihoods. The urban unemployment rate right now is around 6%. How does the government avoid massive layoffs in the wake of the virus outbreak?
Well, it's a huge challenge. I think there are of reports from other institutions and security companies claiming that the unemployment rate is much higher. I've seen the worst number coming from one report saying that it's even up to like 80 million people. Certainly, it's a very grave situation right now, and I think it's particularly hard for people on a job, newly on the job market. This year, in 2 months, there will be 9 million students coming out of college, and it's a huge pressure on the employment market, job market. I think what's a little bit different here in China is that we have a fairly large state sector. We have many large state-owned enterprises, and I think these companies are not operating just under the the assumption of maximizing company profit. I mean, they do have social obligations, and they do have influence from the government. So I think these companies will probably play a key role in trying to hire more people, at least not firing people. The economy is, we have a huge challenge, but we also have a fairly large government. I think the governments are hiring. And our university enrollment is also expanding a little bit, trying to digest some of the people on the job market and get them back to college. So these are the measures that our country is able to do, and that are different, a little bit different from the Western countries. And I think this is actually one area that the political system here in China shows a little bit of an advantage. Because the government does have a lot of influence here. So I think that's a good thing. Now, in terms of the hardship on the people, I think the situation is a little bit different from the United States. Here people have a much higher savings rate. Also the housing ownership is much higher. So there will be less of a strain on people's livelihood. And we have fairly strong family bonds among family members. So I think we can weather through this storm in the next 2 to 3 months if it continues. But hopefully the economy will recover very fast.
Sourabh, what are your thoughts on ensuring employment at this time in China?
Oh, it's an immense challenge, and the real challenge is with regard to small and medium enterprises. As it is, even in good times, the banking sector cannot get money to small and medium enterprises because the banking sector is not that great in assessing credit risk. And so a lot of these companies have had to, in fact, depend on the shadow banking system. And now that over the last few years, that shadow banking system has been reined in because debt has gone out of control. So it's going to be very difficult. I think targeted relief must be provided. There needs to be forbearance, but it's not going to be an easy challenge. But I think there's also a degree of understanding, I think, within Chinese people that when circumstances happen like this, which are just so completely out of control, that one needs to cope and forbear with it. This happened even after the global financial crisis, when a lot of light manufacturing employment was in tatters. But that didn't lead to certain outbreaks in terms of anti-government sentiment, particularly, etc. So I think there will be tolerance and forbearance, but I think the government needs to get very active, and it needs to move away from, say, things like its fiscal deficit target of 3%, stimulate the economy this year in the short and medium term, while keeping reform plans which are on the board ready, and have those implemented next year in terms of that 5-year reform plan.
Anand, a moment ago you were telling us about some of the people who'd be at these 2 sessions meetings, like you mentioned the scientist who will be representing, of course, his sector, or a migrant worker who'd be representing the interests of his group. But there are thousands of delegates coming to these 2 sessions meetings. Who are they? How are they selected? And what happens at the end of these meetings? Is there a huge report issued?
Well, actually, if you look at it, it's very interesting. The biggest difference, if we compare between the Chinese Congress and, for example, the U.S. House of Representatives here in the United States, is that it's much less confrontational during their discussion. That is because almost all of these lawmakers are not like full-time professional politicians, but rather it's just more like an unpaid part-time job for most of them. Some of them are because they're from all walks of life. Some of them are working as scientists, as you said. Some of them work as artists, or as teachers, or professors, or migrant workers, or farmers. So they are representing a very big demographic difference in China, and that is why when they are trying to raise proposals, they're raising proposals based on their own personal working and life experiences, instead of raising proposals based on the constituency and based on the interest of getting votes. So that is why it's very interesting that when they're doing discussion, they are not trying to win media attention or to win the possibility of getting more votes by attacking others and also by being sensational in some of the way of making speeches, but rather a lot of discussion that they make would be very down to earth and I have to say sometimes too specific or too complicated in their own working experience. And sometimes it can be a little bit boring for media coverage, I have to say. But the difference is that once that they are doing that in terms of making them concrete and specific, they are quietly getting the job done instead of being confrontational and making it more dramatic for media.
Okay, John, Gong, we have a couple of minutes left. Looking at foreign relations, there's an analyst at the Australian Lowy Institute, Richard McGregor, and he said he did not think that the pandemic will change Beijing's strategic thinking. He said what he expects is that Beijing will consolidate the party at home and expand its influence across a broad range of areas outside China, including trade, technology, military, and, of course, competition with the United States. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, to some extent, I think the overall direction of China's foreign policy is not going to change, but I think it has an immense set of challenges right now, and these are very specific issues. For example, China's relationship with the United States is getting worse during and after the pandemic, and that's a huge challenge. And also, I think China's Belt and Road Initiative, for example. I would imagine that it's facing a lot of problems because the recipients of these loans made during this program were all mostly developing countries, and they are having a very, very tough time right now. And whether they can meet the debt obligations is a big question. We're already seeing that there's some countries in Africa have been advocating that China to basically write off some of the loans. So I think the challenge and the issues we're facing is in terms of how to deal with these challenges. How do we move forward? How do we, deal with the a lot of I would describe it as an anti-China xenophobic sentiment sweeping across the globe right now.
And that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.